Welcome. I'm Althea Brooks, and I'm Senior Director of Lifetime Learning in the Office of Engagement. It's so good to see the sun this morning, right? Everyone's excited about seeing the sun. It has rained a lot for the last couple of weeks. Let me also welcome our at-home guests. They've logged in, about 1,000 of them this morning, right? Soon to be 1,000. So welcome. We partner with the Alumni Association to offer you more than the score. We've been offering more than the score for about 19 years now. So we're so happy that you show up each Saturday morning before the home football game. Before we begin, go ahead and silence the ringer on your phones. Go ahead and power down for an hour. During the program, we ask that you hold your questions to the end. But should you have a question at the end, a microphone will be brought around to you. Please state your name and your UVA affiliation and speak clearly right into that mic. Questions are appreciated. Okay, we are thrilled to welcome two faculty with us this morning. Michael Lenox from the Darden School of Business and Ethan Heil from UVA Sustainability. And they will discuss the future of electric vehicles and the U.S. Auto industry. And I can't wait to learn from them. How many of you have an electric vehicle? Wow. How many of you are considering purchasing one? Okay, you're in the right place this morning. We are going to learn. So go ahead and advance and give our speakers a nice, warm, more than the score welcome. All right, allow me to introduce them briefly. Ethan Heil is a sustainability and energy engineer at the UVA Sustainability. Ethan works to promote human and ecological health in the built environment. He has worked with a range of municipalities, utilities, and institutions of higher education to develop strategies for decarbonization, climate resilience, and infrastructure. Also, sustainability action planning. As a lecturer, Ethan taught sustainable building and decarbonization courses at the University of Virginia, Stanford University, and PG&E Pacific Energy Center. Ethan is a double who, with a BS in civil engineering and an MS in environmental sciences from the University of Virginia. He also has an engineering degree from Stanford University. So Michael Lenox. Michael holds the Taylor Murphy Professorship in Business Administration at the Darden School of Business. He also holds an appointment at the Darden School of Leadership and Public Policy and the UVA Miller Center. He serves as special advisor to the Dean of the Darden School of Business and the UVA Provost. He leads special projects for them. Currently, he provides leadership for a new initiative, UVA Innovates, which is a platform empowering innovators and entrepreneurs in Charlottesville, the Commonwealth, and beyond for the greater good. Before joining Darden in 2008, Michael was a tenured professor at Duke University School of Business. He received his PhD from MIT, and he also is a double who, with a bachelor and a master of science in systems engineering here from the University of Virginia. Michael is taught at the New York University Stern School of Business and has been a visiting professor at several schools, including Stanford University, Harvard University, and Oxford University. He has published 5 books, and we have 3 of his books over here. The bookstore will be selling today: Strategy in a Digital Age, Decarbonization Imperative, and Can Business Save the Earth? Please help me welcome our 2 esteemed speakers for the morning to More Than the Score.
It is an absolute pleasure to be with you all this morning. Thank you to Althea, thank you to Engagement for inviting me. This is actually my third time, I think, doing More Than the Score, and all very different. I was here for a panel on the honor system. I was here for online education a number of years ago when MOOCs were all the rage. And today I get to talk about another topic that I'm really excited about and have been researching for a number of years, which is the electrification of vehicles and decarbonization more broadly. But before I get into that, I actually want to talk about whales. Okay, not exactly whales. Specifically, I want to talk about the whaling industry. So here you see a picture from 1850 at the height of the New England whaling market. That market, very vibrant, important to the US economy, basically disappeared over a 10-year period starting in about 1850. So what happened? Did we harvest all the whales in the ocean? No. We had discovery of oil in western Pennsylvania, and this gentleman on the right, a Canadian, Abraham Gesner, figured out how to take that oil and turn it into kerosene. So whale oil was used for lighting in city streets and in homes. Quickly, we have a technology disruption leading to the use of kerosene replacing whale oil. By the way, they had a good 30-year run with kerosene. And then this gentleman here, Thomas Edison, invents the incandescent light bulb and suddenly electrification of our cities and homes using this new technology. It's interesting to note, about 120 years after this, we've seen the rise of the LED light bulb. Here's some stats here, just going over into 2019. This has continued here where the cost has come down and adoption has come up in that technology as well. So this idea that markets lead to disruption of new technologies that come in and replace the old is an idea that the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter called creative destruction. He talked about the gales of creative destruction. And in his view, this is actually a signature feature and a good feature of market-based economies, is that we have this capability of creating technology and disruption. So, a little technical here, but this pattern is seen in industry after industry. So the first thing I want to highlight here is this technological performance curve. So we talk a lot about S-curves. The idea of an S-curve is that the improvement of technology is rarely linear. What typically happens is early on in a technology, we're investing in it, trying to improve it, but it just never seems to quite get there. But if it's going to be disruptive, what eventually happens is we get a kink in that improvement curve. We get exponential improvement in the technology. You probably have all heard about generative AI and ChatGPT and the like. I'm here to tell you that is not new. This is a 50-year journey we have been on with artificial intelligence. But for many decades, it just seemed like, man, it's never going to be prime time. And I think it's fair to say we've now reached that inflection point where the improvement curve has started to increase at a rate that it's now becoming regular and being adopted. So once we start to get improvement in technological performance, that's when we start to see adoption. So you think of cumulative revenues here. So those usually lag a little bit, but that performance drives adoption and we start to see markets form around these technology. But again, I'm a business strategist. I've been teaching business strategy for 25 plus years. What really interests me is what happens to competition. And so that's the dark line represented by firms here. So what you almost always see is that you get initially lots of entry, often starting with entrepreneurial ventures coming into the market, trying to tap into this new technology. You see incumbent firms diversifying into the new technology. And then we get the shakeout. When there's so much competition here that companies start to go out of business, and then you're left with maybe a more stable, smaller set of companies competing. Think about Facebook. Like, we remember the winners here. There were literally hundreds of competitors to Facebook in the wake of when they came onto the marketplace. We all remember like maybe MySpace and some of these other social media companies. Apple with the iPhone. Apple was not an early adopter, if you will, of smartphone technology. There was a company called Heil that was one of the entrepreneurial leaders in doing that. Microsoft, HP, Sony, they all had their smartphones that came on the market. But Apple obviously was one of the big winners with their iPhone. So this becomes important because with these patterns, we can start to discern what is happening in the vehicle market here with EVs, and where are we in the potential for disruption? Now, another cycle you might hear about in the popular press is the Gartner hype cycle here, which is this idea that as new technologies come along, we get this peak of inflated expectations and then the trough of disillusionment here. I'm always fascinated when I hear people make reference to the dot-com bust. And they often reference it like, yeah, this new technology, oh, whatever, it's gonna be like the dot-com bust. I don't know about you all, that internet thing, it actually was pretty big. That was pretty big. It wasn't like this was just some flash in the pan here. That pattern you see over and over again. When it comes to AI, it is advancing so quickly, I avoid trying to forecast where the technology will go. The one forecast I believe very strongly in, we are going to have a shakeout in AI companies probably in the next 24 months. When that happens, we will hit this trough of disillusionment. There'll be all these articles written that AI is overblown, this isn't a big deal, we thought it would be huge. No, this is exactly what you would expect to happen when we have a disruptive technology enter the market here. So we can also look at the Gartner hype cycle to also help us understand. And by the way, in EVs, we're kind of in that trough of disillusionment right now. There's been a lot of articles written. I'm going to show you some evidence here that maybe make you question that assessment. So if you look long term, we've had this history of innovative life cycles that have occurred. The first wave of the Industrial Revolution with water power, textiles, and iron, and on and on. We're in this maybe fifth or sixth wave now with AI, clean tech, robots and drones, autonomy, all coming to bear right now. And one of the interesting things that makes it really hard for firms and competitors, it seems like these cycles are moving faster now. They're going faster than they have historically. So again, I have a book called Strategy in the Digital Age. We talk a lot about what has been happening in the digital space. And what you see are any number of massive disruptions that have occurred here. You can think of the good old Sears Roebuck here being replaced by online retail by the likes of Amazon. Kodak is one of my favorite examples. It's one of the simplest stories to tell. They made film, the world went digital, they went bankrupt. But the fact of the matter was, as early as 1980, Kodak saw the potential for digital. They put billions of dollars of R&D in it. They had the first patents on digital imaging. They had one of the first digital cameras on the market, and yet they still couldn't make the transition. In their particular case, one of the reasons, they assumed no matter how digital we went with taking images, we'd still print them all out. And so they missed the way we now consume them online rather than printing out most of our pictures. And again, Netflix with Blockbuster, Uber with what it's done to the cab industry. Uber is fascinating to me because they disrupted an old industry here with nothing more than a piece of software on your phone. Right? They don't have cars, they don't have depots. All they did is they created what we call a two-sided market, connecting drivers with riders, completely disrupted the industry. So I love this line from Peter Drucker. This is not an exact quote. I couldn't find the exact quote. But the failure of once successful businesses is rarely that they forget what made them successful. It is what made them successful is no longer valued in the marketplace. So why technology is so disruptive is that it is often these incumbent firms really struggle to make the launch and the jump to the new technology. And again, it's not because they're forgetting what they used to do. They're finding it very hard to make the transition to the new technology. All right, so let's talk about automobiles. Any car aficionados out there? All right, can you tell me what this is a picture of? What particular brand of automobile this is? Big points if you can get this. It is not a Ford, not a Packard. Studebaker, you win, you get the prize right there, good job. This is a Studebaker. How many of you have heard of Studebaker? Most people have heard of Studebaker. It's in the popular imagination. They have been long bankrupt, if you didn't know that. Many, many decades ago, they went bankrupt. But the reason I like to highlight Studebaker is that most people don't know this. They were the #1 carriage manufacturer in the United States in the post-Civil War period. They had about 60% market share in the carriage industry. If we were going to talk about like the top fortune companies in 1880, Studebaker would be on that list. Great, successful company. Now, here comes the disruption, the horseless carriage, the automobile. And to their credit, they make the transition to producing automobiles. but they never achieved the same level of success that they had in the old market and eventually went bankrupt and are now this footnote in history. So here we are 100 plus years later, and we've got another potential disruption. So again, car aficionados, anybody know who makes this car? You might even be able to see it on it. BYD. How many, in show of hands, have heard of BYD? Okay, good. If you haven't heard of them, you should be paying attention. This is the Chinese company. They are the #1 EV manufacturer in the world. This car here is called the Seagull. It is listing retail $11,000 US in both China and now in Europe, coming to Europe here. So and by the way, it has 250-mile range here. So this is a disruptor, to say the least. Let's talk about another disruptor, one you probably know better. This is the Tesla Model Y. This is the #1 car in the world. It is the #1 selling car in the United States. It is the #2 vehicle sold in the United States, because #1 for decades has been the Ford F-150. So the Ford F-150 is still #1, but the Model Y is the #1, at least auto, if you could find the Ford as a truck. To give you a sense of the scale of their advantage, the Model Y sold upwards of 385,000 vehicles in the United States last year. BMW's 3 Series, 30,000 vehicles. So they sold 10x what the BMW 3 Series sold. And this is arguably kind of a comparable replacement for that. And by the way, the BMW 3 Series had been the category leader in that kind of lower end luxury vehicle market there. So Tesla has had incredible success and continues to be a market disruptor here. All right, so let's use our life cycle here to try to discern where this is going here. So let's talk technical performance first. So if you're not aware, there's an incredible decrease in the price of lithium-ion batteries here over the last decade plus. This is in part why this market has become viable. If you extend it out to the more recent time, it's starting to level off. Again, S-curves here, you would expect this to occur. But again, we're still reducing the price of these lithium-ion batteries. I think it is not an unreasonable guess that within the next 2 or 3 years, the batteries will be cheap enough that these cars will be cheaper than internal combustion engines at the point of sale. And again, you sometimes hear a lot of people say, oh, these EVs are so expensive. But remember, whether you're looking at a Rivian or a Tesla, they're playing at the very high end of the market here. These are luxury vehicles here with comparables that are roughly the same price for what they're selling here. So costs have come down. They've come down to the point now, this is a little hard to read, but TCO stands for total cost of ownership. So if you look at the total cost of ownership, including maintenance and servicing, which there's very little to do with that on the EVs, and of course the cost to charge the car via electricity versus using gas, the total cost of ownership of EVs are already lower than their equivalents in internal combustion engines here. So again, if you think about these curves and when disruption occurs, when on kind of the current dimensions of merit, the new technology overtakes the old technology, that's when we often get this kind of exponential growth, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. So along those lines, let's see what's happening to sales. So here you see some data on number of new electric cars sold worldwide. So huge exponential growth over the last 5 years, being led by China. If you're not aware, China is the global leader on electric vehicles. You see the EU. The US is a laggard here in adoption and sales of EVs. So that's the stock and flow here. That was the flow. Here's the stock of cars. So similarly, not surprisingly, the stock of cars on the road that are EVs continues to grow exactly with that exponential growth curve that you would expect to see if we're going to see a disruption. Once again, China being a leader, the US being somewhat of a laggard still. All right, this to me is the most important graph. If you think about auto sales, it is very tied to the business cycle. So good times, people buy cars. Recessions, people do not buy cars. There has been a lot written recently about declines in sales of EVs. I am telling you, separate the signal from the noise here. What you need to be looking at is the percent of new cars sold that are electric. Because again, the number of autos being sold in any given month is always going up and down based on the economy and the like. So it's the percent of new cars that are electric. That continues to go up exponentially here. And if you're curious, the red there is battery electric. The blue is plug-in hybrids. So the plug-in hybrid kind of vehicles there. Not to offend anybody who's a plug-in hybrid owner, I do think that's a transitional technology that will be quickly replaced by battery-powered electrics, especially as the range and other things improve here. There's just some advantages to full battery electric, largely around the cost, that I think will quickly overtake that. And we could talk more about that if that's of interest. Now, to be clear, as this increases, we're still got a long way to go. And if you're, care about climate change, if you care about decarbonization here, we're still a long way from where we are going to decarbonize our vehicle stock here. Even if I could wave a magic wand and have 100% of new car sales be battery-powered electric, it will still be a decade plus before we get all the old cars off the roads and replaced with battery electrics here. So we are still a long way from decarbonization in this sector, but the signs are very positive here in terms of what is happening on this transition. If we look globally, it's fascinating. Norway is the global leader. 93% of new car sales in Norway now are electric vehicles. Sweden's right behind it, about 85%. You can see the EU overall, 20%. So 1 in 5 new cars sold in the EU is an electric. China, 40%. So nearly half of new cars sold in China at this point are EVs. Sadly, the US is trailing here. We're only about 10% of new cars are EVs there. And that might have some competitive implications for us as a country when you think about our homegrown auto market here. So if you look at the share of cars currently in use that are electric, again, the stock rather than just the flow, we still have a long way to go, to my point earlier. We have about 7-8% in China. That's the one that's furthest along. United States, it's still only about 2% of the cars on the road are EVs, because again, we've got this stock to work through here. All right, last but not least, let's talk about the competitive implications here. Again, as a business strategist, this is what interests me the most. Are we seeing a shakeout? What will that shakeout likely look like? So first, observe, as to be expected when we have a new technology, we have seen lots of entrepreneurial entry here. One of the misgivings I think you sometimes see in the popular press is that when an entrepreneurial venture fails, they then say, well, the market isn't there. No, I'm here to tell you 1 in 10 ventures may be successful, especially in this space here. Failure is to be expected. There's going to be a lot of fishers and others who are trying the market and go out of business here. That is the way disruption occurs. But occasionally, one of these entrepreneurial ventures takes off. So we obviously know about Tesla and what they've been able to achieve over a relatively short period of time. This chart doesn't even have BYD, which again is the global leader. BYD actually has been around for a number of decades, but they obviously pivoted to electric vehicles more recently as their primary focus as a company. So again, if you look at the largest EV manufacturers at this point, you see 2, in essence, entrepreneurial startups here with BYD and Tesla, and then you see a lot of the established auto companies getting into this business and trying to grab their market share here. Geely Auto Group, if you've never heard of them, actually holds Volvo, and they are actually a Chinese conglomerate of companies there. Stellantis is the old Chrysler as part of that portfolio, and they also, I believe, have Fiat and others that are in that group there. So again, you get a sense of where each are playing. It's interesting to know Tesla, pure play, battery electric, some of the others doing both plug-ins and plug-in hybrids and battery electric as well. What's interesting as this plays out is to think about how this is going to disrupt the automotive supply chain. So let's start with the use case here. This is actually Brownsville, a gas station down the road in Crozet here. Obviously, the need for charging infrastructure is going to disrupt the industry. I am very actually optimistic about charging infrastructure. You hear a lot about it. I actually think it's overblown. And the following reason. This is where markets work really effectively. Wawa, Sheetz, pick your favorite convenience store. They are installing EV chargers as fast as they can. They understand that as this dynamic takes place, there's going to be more people who need charging infrastructure, and they're going to build that out. It doesn't mean there are not going to be bumps in the road, but it is happening, and I am optimistic that that will meet the needs that we have. I think the other thing that is often missed when people talk about range anxiety is the ability to charge at home. That is a game changer. I don't know about you all, not to pick on my wife, but there have been times with our old gasoline-powered car where I jump in the car and it's empty, right? And now I'm going to be late for the meeting because I got to go to the gas station and I hadn't planned on that in my time and all that. Never happens with an EV because, at least if you have the ability to, you can charge at home and you basically always have a full tank. Many of the electric vehicles on the market now allow you to drive 4 hours before you need to charge. So you think about your daily travel, and like if you're coming from Northern Virginia, I just did this yesterday in an EV. I drove up to Northern Virginia and back in the same day, never needed to charge, went into my garage, charged it again. So again, not to overstate this, but I think charging is maybe a fear, but not a reality for those who've actually used these cars and understand the dynamic there. Second thing I'd observe, the model that most of the legacy auto companies have in the US is one in which the dealers are independent and they basically make their money off of after-sales service, right? They make some money off the car sales, but really what they want you to do is come back and get that oil change. Guess what you don't do in an EV? You don't get an oil change. If you're not aware, these are simple machines. In an internal combustion engine, you have fuel injectors, you have exhaust systems, you have coolant systems, you have your oil and gas, the oil. All of these systems are expensive to make and maintain. An EV is a battery stack and an electric motor. And so as a result, they require almost no servicing. And by the way, because you have regenerative braking, so when you pull off the gas, it actually slows down because of the electric motor, you don't even use your brakes that much. So you get a lot longer of your brakes. The one exception might be your tires. You might need to replace your tires, largely because we all love the acceleration and we accelerate too fast and we're wearing through our tires too quickly there. But beyond that, a lot lower cost of ownership there. That's going to change the dealership model. It is a reason why companies like Tesla and Rivian, they don't have dealerships. A lot of them you just buy right online, and then you might have a service center to go pick them up. But it's not a dealership model in the way most of the legacy auto companies in the US are organized. All right, assembly. Because of that simple nature of the car, what we're seeing is even further automation than we've seen before in vehicles. This worries me for the viability of the incumbent US players here. We are already seeing the unions at GM and Ford fight this transition to EVs because they know you will need far fewer people in the manufacturing plants. I like to say it's a little too cute. Technology always wins. So if you think you can fight this by, striking and saying, we need the good luck. Just to give another quick aside, what's happened this week with the ports and the worry about automation. I feel bad for the people who work at the ports. They will be automated. It's an easy AV solution there. It makes sense from a cost standpoint. It hurts in terms of their jobs and the like, I get that, but I'm not sure you fight the technology. All right, so assembly. Last but not least, suppliers here. So again, the whole supply chain is going to change here, where you have all of these suppliers, again, whether it's a muffler or whether it's a fuel injector and the like, all of that goes away, and largely it becomes the battery. The battery is by far and away the critical component of these cars. So let's talk about what's happening here. And I think as the US, we should be scared by this. This is the market share of the world's top EV battery manufacturers. CATL, BYD, SK On, CLAB, I'm probably missing some, all Chinese companies. Panasonic, that's going to be Korean, LG, Korean, Samsung, Korean. Basically, the market for EV batteries is dominated by Asia, and we are just not a player in that. And it even gets worse. So that is just in the cell and component manufacturing phase of the business. That's what that last chart. Upstream from that, you have battery material processing, mining, and raw materials production. So the good news is something like lithium is actually available around the globe. And there are different countries, Australia, Africa, who are mining lithium. It's not, while there are short-term supply constraints, there is enough global supply to meet our battery needs. However, most of that lithium, almost all of it, is processed in China. So if we look at this supply chain here, like I said, this yellow here is China. About 18% of mining of lithium is done by China. They do have this dominant position in graphite, so another input into the battery technology. But look at the key materials processing, 70%, 80%, 78%, 82%. Near monopoly positions in the supply chain of these batteries. Even a Tesla, which does have their own battery manufacturing down, I think in Arizona and some other locations, are still largely using Chinese-made batteries to put into their cars. So we're at a real disadvantage as a country as it relates to this. And this is one of the reasons it's become actually a geopolitical issue of whether this industry, which is coming, whether we're going to be a big player here. And so, and I apologize, I'm kind of ending on a sad note here, but this right here is another vehicle from BYD. It's called the U8, and it is competing at the highest levels of luxury. They are moving upstream in the same way we saw Toyota and Honda do back in the 1980s, where they started in the kind of the cheap car market, they improved their quality, and then they moved upstream to the luxury market. We're seeing the exact same thing. So I would not dismiss BYD as a cheap Chinese car manufacturer. Who would ever want to buy one of these things? We've been there before. We've been there again with Toyota and Honda. We've been there with Hyundai and Kia. This is looking very similar here, where they are literally trying to dominate the global market here. And again, we can have a further discussion about the way China policy around technology and industrial development plays out and how they help their industries get to the point that they are. But this is the reality that we're in right now. On a more positive side, we do have Tesla. We do have Rivian. We do have these companies who are emerging, who are establishing themselves as global leaders here. But I do worry about Ford and GM. I do worry about our legacy auto companies here. They are pulling back on their EV production. I think it's short-sighted, and it makes me very worried about whether they're going to survive a disruption like this. Probably most likely what will happen is we'll start to see mergers and acquisitions. We'll start seeing these companies trying to glom together to try to survive this disruption. And so, again, I don't know exactly how this will play out, but the history has not been kind to companies in this position. On a more positive side, looking at Tesla, Tesla's old mission statement used to be providing the world sustainable transportation. They changed it about 5-6 years ago to providing transition to sustainable energy. So there's other things happening here that we might be able to take advantage of. So as we think about decarbonization wholly here and the need to move to renewable energy for electrical generation, it is creating the need for what we call distributed energy. So suddenly, solar panels on your home, you have maybe a battery stack provided by Tesla, your car is a battery and could actually charge your home and even provide electricity to the grid during times that you're not using it. All of that creates some real interesting opportunities here, both for decarbonization, but also for electric vehicles. Tesla is pushing that narrative. So you can get your Tesla solar panels, their Tesla charging wall, your Tesla vehicle, and then you can do some really creative things in terms of your electrical usage and balancing the grid. And this is something I talk about in my decarbonization imperative work, where we are seeing the kind of the will of both the marketplace, but also kind of the global community, is this idea that if we are going to decarbonize and get ourselves off of fossil fuels, we need to electrify. So we obviously are thinking about electrification of vehicles. We're also talking about electrification of buildings and not using like natural gas for heating and hot water heating. We're also talking about industrials, industrial processes and the like. Where could they be electrified? There's some real limits. Things like steel and cement are incredibly hard to decarbonize, but the world is pushing for more electrification. And again, maybe to scare everyone a little bit, one of the new research projects I've started is looking at data centers and AI and what's happening there. And so we are moving into a world where we need to massively increase the amount of electrical generation that we have, and preferably do so in a decarbonized way, either nuclear or renewables and the like. But the positive spin is that EVs are part of the solution, not just because they're decarbonizing, because they also are these batteries that could help with decentralized distributed energy as well. So there are going to be pressures on EVs in general that are going to lead to interesting solutions. All right, last slide. There's another disruption on the horizon here, which is called AVs, autonomous vehicles. These are yet another one of those classic technologies where you probably think about the S-curve and you're like, man, people have been talking about AVs now for a decade. When are they ever really going to be ready for prime time? Hard to answer here, but there is a lot of progress being made on these. If this comes to be, let's say in the next decade, it will radically change the automotive industry. In fact, it might change it to a world in which we don't own cars anymore. We just have ride-sharing markets where you use your app, a car comes to your house, takes you where you go. By the way, if we go that route, the utilization of any individual vehicle goes way up. If you're like me, I get in my car, I drive 15 minutes to camp or to grounds, then I go to work all day, then I drive home and it sits all day, right? So I drive it for like 25 minutes in a given day. In an AV world, you get constant utilization potentially here. What that means is we need far fewer cars, right? So all of this proves to be even a more disruptive potential for the automotive industry that we're saying. All right, with that, let me end my comments here. Let me bring up Ethan here, and we're going to discuss what UVA is doing to deal with this set of disruptions that are coming here. So Ethan, please have a seat. And we're then going to open it up for some Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
So Ethan, let me ask one. Does UVA believe in my story about disruption?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the perfect introduction, that it really does well to frame exactly how we view EVs, both in terms of how we make decisions and the uncertainty around it too.
Mm-hmm. All right, tell me a little bit about our fleet. You know, tell us, for people who aren't aware, like, what is our impact on transportation and how are we thinking about electrification of vehicles?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I think about electrification of vehicles, EVs in general, I think of 3 lanes. You know, the one that probably comes to mind first for most of you is our buses. It's our most visible aspect of the fleet. And they're important because they help our community get around, right? So that's kind of one lane. Then we have our operational fleet, sort of like the work vehicles that kind of happen behind the scenes. There's different strategies to use for both of those. And
can you tell me how many, do you have a rough idea of how many vehicles?
In the range of about 500.
About 500. So again, we have a large, fleet of vehicles.
Yeah, a lot of them, again, are hidden kind of behind the scenes, or you'll see them driving down and doing work. And yeah, keeping like this small city that is the University of Virginia running.
Yeah.
And then the final kind of like adjacent, maybe third prong is thinking about how do we invest in EV charging infrastructure to support EVs in the broader community.
Yeah. So tell me more. Let's start with the charging infrastructure. What are we doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the charts you showed about the industry life cycle, we are right in the middle of that, and we're honestly trying to figure out like what disruptions are coming and what's the best investment in providing charging infrastructure. There are questions around, okay, well, we know we have our fleet and we're transitioning those to EVs. So let's invest in charging infrastructure because there's certainty there.
Yeah.
Where there's a little bit more uncertainty is, do our faculty and staff, do they need a charger? You mentioned charging at home, right?
Yep.
So we know our first movers, they tend to charge at home, just anecdotally. But at some point, as the EV market matures, we're probably going to have more visitors to the university or employees to the university that might not have charging at home, right? So how do we, again, think about that? How do we prioritize that? And even within the EV charging infrastructure space, there is the shakeout that's happening.
Yeah.
We've already seen companies transition, go out of business. And so there's a little bit of a chicken and an egg there, where we're trying to pilot things, but really figure out, talk with our peer universities, other fleets, because there's a lot of uncertainty.
If people aren't aware, by the way, and this is very common when we have technology disruptions, there's been a standards battle around the charging infrastructure, largely because of the IRA Act recently. It's Tesla actually is going to win this. So they put incentives in for Tesla to open up their network. And so basically everybody's going to have the Tesla style charger in their cars and be able to use the Tesla superchargers in the near future here. And again, that's very common when we see this disruption here. Tell me, what about like students? Do we see, I don't know how many percentage of students have cars. I suspect it's maybe higher than people realize. Have we thought about them as a constituency?
Yeah, the interesting thing about students is we have to think about them even into like a space that we haven't talked about a lot today is this idea of micromobility. So students are, I think, quicker to adopt these e-bikes, e-scooters that you might have seen running around too. So we have to think about students are coming to grounds, sometimes living on grounds, and now they have this asset that they need to charge, right? And so again, we're trying to figure out how to do this in a way that's both safe and fair too, because again, we've had decades of history where we just haven't had to think about this, and the infrastructure isn't there yet. So yeah, we're figuring it out in real time.
This is where I have to play the old man card, like just walk, kids. But no, they all take the e-scooters everywhere, and it's my son, who's just a recent grad, I always give him a hard time. He's like taking his e-scooter. I'm like, just walk, you can do it. But But it's a reality. We have to deal with that there. Tell me more about when you have a fleet. What are some of the opportunities having a fleet gives us as a university?
Yeah, the interesting thing, and to take a step back, maybe at the risk of oversimplifying, I think about the difference between internal combustion engines and EVs kind of as running on a bunch of little explosions or running on electrons. And so there are some vehicles that benefit from having these running on electrons. You mentioned you can charge back into the grid, so it brings entirely new capabilities to our fleet that can make us be better at our operations. But on the flip side, there are some things that little explosions are better at. For example, a lot of our vehicles need to push snow on the few days we get snow here, right? And EVs aren't there yet. And so it's basically a test case. We'll kind of go out, we'll buy a vehicle, we'll kind of push it to its limits. Where it works for EVs, this idea of the total cost of ownership, that makes 100% sense. Like we're there, but sometimes we're just not there yet in terms of, we have a lot of these medium and heavy duty vehicles that do very specific things, like a vacuum truck. It's hard to go out and find an EV vacuum truck, right? The market's not there yet.
What about buses? So you started with buses. So
Exactly.
what are the challenges there?
Yeah, I mean, the buses we see, range is a bit of a challenge, but we also know that there's a clear path forward. So I think UVA's, we're all in on EV buses, and it's just about how fast are we going to get there.
Yeah.
Again, going back to the industry life cycle, we actually placed an order for buses a few years ago for a company that since went bankrupt. So we were planning on having buses, here today, or even 6 months ago, but we're still waiting on those. And so I think it's a reality of the space. We made a bet. We kind of lost that bet, but that doesn't mean we're done. It just means we had to shift to another manufacturer, and they take a couple of years to build.
Yeah, and again, I'd highlight, this is a feature of disruption. Like you just have to expect this is going to happen. There's going to be certain suppliers that go out of business. Technology standards will change. Technology will improve, which even for UVA, as a capital expenditure, when to time that, right? Because if you go too early before the technology is right, you might get an inferior technology that you just spent and going to have. How long do we hold buses for usually? Do you know?
Yeah, 8 to 12 years.
8 to 12 years. So these are long-term capital investments that you'd want to get right.
Exactly. Yeah, there's that tension, throughout our decision-making process. We've won some bets. We've been a first mover in general, and I think being a first mover, you kind of lose this space. Just kind of, I'll do a quick plug for our university. We have the #2 green fleet for a university in the entire nation. So I think that highlights that we're trying to take the first step before maybe there's a corpus of knowledge to know what has worked in our scenario before.
Now, as I talk about EVs, I always get the person who raises their hand and they're like, well, you're charging that with coal-fired power plant there, and so you're really not doing anything good for the environment. How are we thinking about the electrical generation side or the electrical power side for these emerging EVs that we're having?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so we've kind of talked about EVs as being great from a sustainability point of view, from the viewpoint of total cost of ownership, right? We're stewarding our financial resources. Our environmental resources are important too. We have decarbonization goals for the university. So we wouldn't make this, we wouldn't lean into this transition without kind of knowing that answer, right? And we run the numbers, and there's a lot of great papers about this, but basically, countrywide, EVs are better for the environment when you look at a life cycle and you're running it on the local grid.
Yeah.
In addition to that, Virginia has a cleaner grid. So again, we're starting from a great point. It's only getting greener over time, and the university procures renewable energy. That brings our emissions down even further.
Yeah, and I have to brag for a second. We partnered at the Darden School with UVA Sustainability on the Holyfield solar plant with Dominion Power, and it allowed us in 2019 to be net zero as a business school. We were one of the first in the nation, maybe the first in the nation to do that, and we've been recognized as like the most sustainable business school in the world as a part of that and other things we've done. So we are trying to take a lead on this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So at this point, let me open it up to questions you have for either Ethan and I. Yeah, right here in the front. Oh, sorry. We're going to do mics. Sorry, we're going to bring mics to you here because we do have people online.
Looking at the big energy spreadsheet for the world, has anyone thought about how much energy the planet Earth, how much electrical energy the planet Earth can realistically make? In other words, how much lithium is there? How many raw materials are there for solar panels? Has anyone made a model to see what the maximal amount of energy the planet Earth could make and how sustainable that would be over time? And can we really, will we be able to meet our needs with electricity? For example, I doubt that we could have an electrified military, for example. And as I've gotten older, I've come to realize, regrettably, that militaries are a fact of life.
Yeah.
How about commercial airlines, this sort of thing?
Yeah.
You know, can we recycle our lithium batteries? It's the big spreadsheet over time. How much electricity can the planet Earth realistically make?
Yeah, there are some really great efforts. There's one at MIT I know of that is really trying to answer that big picture question. We're talking about EVs today. There are other pieces of even the transportation sector that are difficult. You mentioned airlines, airplanes. There is some really interesting efforts on electrification of airplanes, but right now the assumption is short haul flights at best. Long haul flights, you just do not have the energy density in a battery to be able to put that up in the air. It's heavy. So there is a big push for what they're calling sustainable aviation fuel out of the industry. Lots of thoughts on what does that mean. There's a push to maybe hydrogen as a feedstock in some of these cases. Long haul shipping is another one where there are some efforts at electrification, but some concerns that it just isn't energy dense enough given the weight to make that work. Not to be too dystopian, EVs are probably the one I'm most optimistic on us making a transition. There are lots of part of our decarbonization challenge that are going to be really, really hard. I'll just mention steel and cement again. They are the backbone of our global economy. We don't substitute away from them easily. If you think about our built environment, there are interesting solutions like timber, structural timber. We have one of the largest structures here in Charlottesville on the East Coast, the Apex office building. 7, 8 stories, maybe getting up to like 12 to 15. I know this is an area of your expertise. You can't build a 50-story skyscraper out of structural timber. You need steel and cement. So there's a long way to go. As you can tell, I am a believer in innovation, and I think some of the feedstock worries, I do have some optimism we'll begin to solve. Take cobalt, for example. Cobalt's problematic for a number of reasons. One of them is where it tends to be produced, let's say, is maybe not the most democratic governments in the world in treating people in a good way. There are already interesting efforts to basically innovate cobalt out of the battery architecture. And again, I don't want to be Pollyanna and say, yes, we'll just innovate our way out of these problems, but I'm not sure what the alternative is other than to try to address these individual, including things like recycling of batteries. I know, Ethan, you have some expertise in these areas.
Yeah, I would just add to that fortunately, the light duty and medium duty vehicles that we do see a path forward on EVs, that's the big chunk of the emissions. So in some ways it buys us time to kind of figure out the harder pieces.
Yeah, great point.
One right here.
My name is Robert. I'm a Cavalier by marriage. Several times a week, I read online about various innovations in battery structure and battery manufacturing process, such that, they say a vehicle with a range in excess of 800 miles is not a big deal. My question is, comparing your graphs, what sort of short-term impact do you see that these innovations that are broadcast, how long is it going to take to get those innovations actually into the stream so that it may actually change your graph?
Yeah, and this is where predicting technology is maybe a fool's errand, even though I just was trying to do that. As an MIT grad, I get the Technology Review, which is it's actually their alumni magazine, but it has a great source of like what new upcoming technologies are there. And it's fun to realize like there's things they mentioned 30 years ago that we're just now, seeing hit prime time, and things that they've talked about that haven't come to be. There are a lot of interesting work in battery architecture taking place. Solid state batteries is one that there is some really interesting work being done, and some hope that that might even replace lithium iron. And by the way, the geopolitical implications of that could be good, because then maybe we could overtake China if there's a new battery architecture where we don't, at this supply chain limitation. There are things like hydrogen fuel cells that have been talked about for decades. I would say maybe 7-8 years ago, there was still a lot of debate about hydrogen fuel cells versus battery-powered electric. I think that train's left the station for automobiles. I think there always can be an exception to this, but there was companies like Toyota that were more into hydrogen fuel cells. They've now pivoted back to battery electric. It just seems like that's where the momentum is in the technology now. But again, as I started, you never know what's on the horizon that might come in and just completely disrupt what we're seeing here.
Hi, I drive a plug-in hybrid.
Yeah.
I drive a Toyota RAV4 Prime, and the RAV4 is the second most popular car in the country. But it's also an example of a car that you can compare a gas engine car with an electric car, with for 45 miles or so. And so the way the math works is that if you take a typical RAV4, gas RAV4, it gets 30 miles to the gallon, okay? So my car gets 3 miles per kilowatt, okay? So I can go 30 miles on 10 kilowatts. I pay 15 cents a kilowatt, whereas which would be $1.50 to go 30 miles, versus a gas engine, which would cost me $3. So it basically costs me half. That's the economics of EVs. The problem with it, though, is that I charge at my house. So I put the 15 cent, when I go to charge point, I won't pay 15 cents. So the economics is a little bit more difficult if you don't have a home charger. And if you're going to build a home charging network, the developers like ChargePoint or Tesla are going to want a return on their investment. So I'm not going to get the 15 cents. I'm going to be paying 20, 25, 30 cents. That's for some people to say, well, it's really not much of a savings for me unless I have a home. Can you comment on that?
No, I totally agree. And like I said, I don't want to be dismissive of range anxiety and the charging infrastructure challenges. I do think the charge at home does fundamentally change the calculus, as you're saying there. But we have to recognize not everybody has that opportunity and option. I mentioned like students. Students aren't necessarily going to be able to charge at home, and there is a big challenge there. Let me comment just quickly on plug-in hybrids, and again, I apologize for those of you who own them. The reason I'm maybe a little dismissive is just from the manufacturing standpoint. You basically are building two systems. You're building an internal combustion engine and an electric battery. There's no bending of the cost curve to make that cheaper than a pure electric car. So as range improves and charging infrastructure improves, the logic of a plug-in hybrid, I think, begins to go away. And again, it's not to say it might be the right choice for you at this point in time. But I do think over time we'll see those phased out and we'll go to pure battery electric.
Got one back
Sorry,
here.
we're doing No.
Hello, I'm Patrick D. Shields. Can you give me some comments on how hacking, have you looked into hacking of these vehicles, number one, and number two, the rolling blackouts, how do they impact these vehicles, especially when more are being charged?
Yeah, I think on the hacking, I'm not sure we've seen any like real serious. The only one that comes to mind is my son and I are a guilty pleasure of love the Fast and Furious movies, and there was a great scene where like Charlize Theron was the bad guy, and she like took command of a bunch of vehicles and had them going through the streets. I don't think that's kind of realistic right now. Look, this is a problem, I would say, not just for EVs, but it's also a problem for actually even internal combustion engines. We have, they're all computers now, and they all have some degree of hacking. Are EVs even more susceptible to it? Potentially, because more of the systems are controlled by the electronics there. I always like to say when it comes to cybersecurity and hacking, it's a never-ending battle. It's a never-ending battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And all we can do is be continually diligent on it. And so I think that applies to all of our digital systems there. And then remind me, what was the second question? Oh, rolling blackouts. I haven't thought much about that other than this worry that we're going to have incredible strains on our grid as we have more demand there. We also have, various supply shortages. We've had that with gasoline, where we've had, Houston has a hurricane, and then suddenly we can't get gasoline for our cars. So maybe that's a reality of life in many ways. I do think, like I said, this increased demand on the electrical grid is going to put some strain on prioritization. And I'll just give you one anecdote here. Nucor Steel, who I'm doing some work with, they largely use electricity to do the work that they do, melting scrap metal to make steel products. They're worried that the data centers, the Amazons of the world, are going to come in and pay a huge premium for electricity, and they're going to see their prices go up. I do think this is a short-term reality we're going to see. The big constraint for data centers is we cannot build electrical generation quick enough. And some of it is regulatory. We just can't get new electricity onto the grid. And so the backlog, I think, it's like 2 or 3 years, I think, at this point, to get on the grid.
Gasoline pumps need electricity too.
Yeah, there you go.
Quick question, maybe more of a political question. How long do you think the US will be able to maintain its current tariff policy on Chinese EV manufacturers?
Trying to keep them out of the market?
Yeah.
Oh boy. So I'm involved, as Althea said at the beginning, with the Miller Center on a project on democracy and capitalism. So just small questions. So this could be a whole nother talk on the evolving competitive dynamics with China. And it obviously is both military, it's both socially, and it's of course economically here. Basically, I'm trying to dodge your question here. We are in a moment of decoupling, people call it, that we haven't seen in a long time, like 50 years. Whether that continues is a great question. I can tell you U.S. businesses woke up to this after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia, we aren't that exposed to as a country in terms of what they supply, but they recognize that if China invaded Taiwan and the will of the US people, which would probably be accurate, would be no longer will we accept supplies from China, that is hard to do. We are very integrated with their economy there. So even if we say, BYD, you can't sell your vehicles there, we're still buying all of our batteries from China and all that upscale, stale part. And again, some of the industrial policy that we've seen under the Biden administration is trying to change that. It's trying to jumpstart the U.S. markets here, but it's going to take a while. China has a huge lead on us on building out that kind of clean tech supply chain, not only EVs, but solar, again, batteries and the like. So.
You seem pretty optimistic about AVs.
Yeah.
I'm old, and I've got this. I still have it, a copy of Popular Mechanics magazine that promised us flying cars.
Yes.
Well before the next millennium, and
Yeah.
Here we are. And I could just get the sense. Seems to me that there's a lot of analogies relative to flying cars and all the issues associated with the regulation and everything else, as well as the complexity in AVs. So I was curious what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, again, I'm not going to try to predict when AVs are going to be plying the roads as every normal cars. Though if you're not aware, it's already happening. Like in San Francisco and Phoenix, Waymo is running pilots where they're fully autonomous vehicles plowing the streets there. So it is happening. But I think what you need to look for first is we're going to see niche entry. John Deere has a commercially viable, commercially available tractor or farmerless tractor, if you will. It's a much more tangible problem because you hopefully don't have people running across the field. The risks are lower. You can make that. We don't have them here for some reason at UVA, but most college campuses have these little delivery bots that are going around giving pizzas and stuff to students there. I think that's what we're going to see in the short run. We're going to see more and more autonomous vehicles in these niche positions here. Probably even some cities maybe making areas that are available only to autonomous vehicles. But your guess is as good as mine of when we'll see full autonomy everywhere here. But it is a technological challenge. It's a great example of the 80-20 rule, but I think it's more like the 95-5 rule. AVs work in like 95% of the situations they run into. It's the last 5% that's really, really tough. Really bad with bad weather. You know, they go haywire when you have like snow on the ground and things like that. So there's some serious problems that they have to overcome before they're going to become really widespread. But I think you're going to see more and more adoption and penetration in different parts of our lives.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, and everyone's looking forward to the game. But on behalf of Lifetime Learning and the Alumni Association, we want to thank our speakers today for volunteering their time. And thank you all for joining us online. We've got the bookstore here, so stop by and buy a book. But enjoy the game. We've got a little gift for our
thank you.
speakers.
Thank you very much.